Hello, welcome back. Recently I produced a video called Art Deco Opulence, and we featured Kerry and his wife's home in the Riverside estate, and we discussed very briefly some of the work, some of the magnificent work he's done at restoring that home and extending it, and some of the intricacies and the difficulties that he experienced, specifically because he wanted the era to be maintained. He wanted the feel of the house to maintain the Art Deco influence. And it's important to understand where Art Deco came from. Art Deco developed after the Roaring 1920s, the Roaring 20s as we like to call it, where global economies were very good. So everyone was experiencing great times during the Roaring 20s. Building costs were very high, very intricate. And then obviously in the 30s, things changed and soured leading up to World War II. So in the 1930s, there was a need for building costs to be a lot lower, for lines to be more simplistic. So if you have a look at, for example, the difference between an Art Deco home and a Californian bungalow or Federation style, you'll see that the designs have become more simple all over that era. And a lot of people talk about heritage or period homes or as though it's rocket science. It really isn't. A period home is just a home built in that period. So in 2025, whatever homes are built this year are part of the 2025 period. But it's easy to classify homes back in the old days because a lot of the homes were very, very similar, had similar design, and they had defined design through the regulatory authorities, both here and overseas. A lot of the homes were built the same way by developers. So you had the Victorian era, followed by the Federation era, followed by homes like California bungalows, and then Art Deco. So Art Deco after the 20s, homes became more simplified, leading into contemporary style homes today, or styles that are open to anyone's interpretation. But it's important to understand what period homes are and what heritage means. So heritage, the reason why councils have a heritage overlay, and we're going to explain in this video how that relates to value, to try and demystify what heritage is all about, whether it's good or bad. But the whole purpose of it is to retain the feel of an area. So you want to be able to drive into some of these estates, like the Riverside estate, which has a pre and post-war era. A lot of the homes were built in that pre and post-war. Some of them were in the 1920s as well, but most of them in that 30s and 40s era. So a lot of people want to feel, they want to go into an estate and retain the benefits of that feeling in that era, but they also want to have the benefits of modern day lifestyle as well. So that council does allow modern extensions and renovate, and I'll explain how that works. Listen on. So this here is classified significant. It's an Art Deco masterpiece. You can see there portholes, curved verandas, steel windows, terracotta tiles, Art Deco lines. This has the highest classification. It's on the register. So the city of Boroondara is the richest city in Melbourne, followed by the city of Stonington. And the reason for that is if you add up the capital improved values of all the properties in that city, they work out to be the highest. And the city of Boroondara, if I could just focus on that city specifically, they classify there are three classifications under the heritage overlay. We're specifically talking about the Riverside estate, and that will explain a lot of things. So the three classifications that I want to talk about are significant, contributory, and non-contributory. And if I can start with non-contributory, what that really means is there are properties in that estate that were built after 1960 in the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. And what that means is that they don't contribute to the pre and post-war era. Therefore, if someone comes along and knocks down those homes, it doesn't impact the feel of the area because it's not a pre and post-war home. And therefore, those particular homes, even though they're under a heritage overlay, they're classified as non-contributory, which means it's no different to you buying a house somewhere where there's no heritage overlay. There are pretty much no restrictions when it comes to demolition. and also in terms of what you can build, you can pretty much build whatever you like. So those people that are concerned about buying homes in a heritage overlay which are classified as non-contributory don't need to have those fears, because you can still develop on that property. The other classification is what we call contributory, and contributory are homes that were in fact built in this era, but of themselves they're not significant. In other words, if you knock down one of those homes, it doesn't change the area specifically because it's not a significant home. However, if you start bowling over one and the other and another one, and pretty soon if you start knocking down homes that are contributory, pretty soon the whole area starts to change. Because if you're bowling over a home that was built in 1930 and another one that was built in 1920 and another one that was built in the 1940s, pretty soon nothing becomes pre and post war, and therefore the place doesn't retain its heritage feel. So those properties are classified by the local municipality as contributory, and usually they have an architectural specification, whether it be the roof form, the brick types, etc., the design. Each property has its own specific, like for example, Kerry's home has portholes, it has wraparound verandas. He spoke a lot about curbs, etc. So each one of those homes has been classified by the municipality as being contributory, meaning it contributes to that heritage place and that heritage era, that pre and post-war era. And therefore some of the things you can do with those homes, you can actually extend to the rear and you can have a modern extension so long as you keep the facade, and you can also extend to the side, and you can build something modern. So the council doesn't mind you building something contemporary both to the side of the home or to the rear of the home, so long as you're not touching the facade and the roof line and usually the fence as well. So long as you're not touching any of those things, they don't mind seeing modern period. They don't mind that combination, as long as you're not knocking down or touching what's there already. Okay, so that's and I'll give you an example of some modern designs. Now, Kerry, if you listen to the video, Kerry was talking about how he didn't like Art Deco homes with modern extensions. In other words, where they were creating modern extensions not in keeping with the period. So he thought it was a better idea to spend more money doing the extension but keeping it with period. And obviously it's more expensive that way, but that's what he wanted. So look, there's nothing wrong with a modern extension. It's really up to the individual. But what's important in these heritage areas is to retain the facade. So then we come to the third classification, which is the highest classification, which is called significant. And that's usually properties that are on the register, or on the heritage register. And there are two in the Riverside estate that are classified as significant, and both of them have significant architectural characteristics. One of them is the Man House, which I've covered off on a previous video, and another one is this property in the Riverside estate, which you can see is similar to Kerry's house but retains more significant attributes related to that era. So these two properties are what we call significant, and the restrictions and the local restrictions that are imposed on these two properties are a lot more significant than properties that are only classified as contributory. So hopefully that explains some of the classifications of non-contributory, contributory and significant. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about, well, firstly show you examples of that, and also I want to talk about how it relates to valuations. So this is an example of a contemporary design, non-contributory, and this is contributory. Okay, two similar height double-storey properties. One contributes to the area, pre and post-war era, and the other one doesn't. Another good example, 1930s period style, contemporary style. So that's non-contributory and contributory, two different eras. This one here, despite being a contemporary, it's a nice property. Obviously the owners would never look to knock it down.
but if they did, they'd be able to get permission to do so. But this one here, no, and if you have a look at the back there, you can see a little extension right at the back. They've already started. It doesn't impact the heritage build form. This is a good example of a Californian bungalow, classified contributory, but you can see there a modern extension to the rear. They've kept some of the features there, the eaves, in keeping with the original, and also the roof line, etc. But if you have a look at the windows there, you've got aluminium windows at the rear and you've got timber windows at the front. So the council don't mind that. They don't mind the modern extension as long as the home is retained. Now this one's a tricky one. This one's contributory, non-contributory. Okay, so this is a modern design. The owner decided to build something in keeping with the area, but the classification is non-contributory. This one's contributory. This is the original clinker brick, 1930s. You can see there with the tapestry bricks, the terracotta tile roofing, and all the features of properties in that era. Contributory, non-contributory. Beautiful, modern, Miami Vice type home. Non-contributory, you can knock it over. Contributory, you can't. Contributory, 1920s California bungalow. Non-contributory, modern contemporary design. This is a contributory, and you can see here, they're going to start building to the rear.
Okay, this channel is really about buyers and helping them make the right decision when they buy real estate, and hopefully it's an education channel for people from all walks of life to learn about property, something that I love, that's dear to my heart. The topic today is really about heritage overlays and properties on the register, and how do we know what the impact of that overlay is on the value of the property, whether it be the land value, the total value, or the benefit that a developer, or the detriment that the overlay has on a developer wishing to develop a property that has that overlay. So what are the things we need to look out for, and how do we determine whether we make the purchase or not? So at the outset, it's important to know that you can't really make general statements about overlays. You can't just say, well, a heritage overlay impacts the value, it's not good for developers, you shouldn't buy properties with overlays, etc. You just really can't make those sweeping statements, and I'll give examples as we talk. So I think it's very, very important at the outset to make sure that buyers look at every property on a case by case. You can see the example with Kerry's house, the Art Deco home, the video that I've just recently done. He specifically wanted to buy in an area with a single dwelling covenant, and he specifically wanted to improve, didn't want to add a modern extension on that house. So what he really wanted was a property that was of that era, and a property that didn't have any unit development. So what was really important to him, what created scarcity for him and value for him, was two things. One, a property with a single dwelling covenant, and you'll notice in the Riverside estate there are no units. And the other thing that was really valuable to him is he wanted to have an opportunity to create what he created in an area which valued properties of that era and of that standard. So that was really important to him. Now, Kerry doesn't represent the majority of people out there, but he does represent a group of people that will pay over the odds, or are happy to part with their money if they're able to get what they want. So it's important to understand that a heritage overlay or a property that's listed on the register is very, very valuable to a lot of people. Maybe not the masses, but it's very, very valuable to a lot of people. And those people are prepared to part with their money in order to get what they want. So that's why it's very, very important to always look at a property individually. So one at a time, one property. No one should be making grand statements about overlays.
This is a good example of a post-war home that's been done up, and modern extension to the rear with swimming pools, etc. Internally it has marble staircases, So you can see there, contributory, 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 non-contributory.
In terms of total value, it is true that areas that don't have an overlay, typically if I can talk about Balwyn, for example, or Balwyn North, those areas that don't have an overlay can typically achieve higher prices. There have been prices, you know, close to $7 million that have been achieved in the municipality, even greater than that, where the construction is unrestricted and where people can come along and just build whatever they like. And there are typically local or overseas buyers that have purchased properties where there are no overlays, and they've either been custom made or spec'd out, and the design can, the design can be quite opulent and can be quite significant. And generally speaking, although there haven't been a lot of these properties, generally speaking, the properties that have achieved the highest prices have been properties where there haven't been covenants. So that is true. Now, I just want to make 2 points about properties that have a heritage overlay or are on the register, and where specifically that overlay relates to the building. It is true that construction costs can be high, obviously, because you have to take into account the build form that is there, and it needs to be in keeping with the overlay restrictions. So it is true that the building costs will be higher. However, it's also true that because you don't need to build something and something's already pre-existing, there are savings on not having to build it from scratch. In other words, not having to pay for base stage, frame stage, etc. So there's a trade-off, if you like, between higher building costs and costs that you save by not having to rip the whole thing down, assuming it's in pretty good nick. Now, sometimes that may not work out, and it can be actually costlier. It may be cheaper just to knock the whole thing down and to start from scratch. That is true, and that does happen often and in some cases. But again, you've got to look at every case on its merits, and you need to be looking at every property on a case by case. But generally speaking, if you leave the building there, you're going to be saving a lot of money on having to construct something brand new. But the construction costs typically will also be a little bit higher. Now, getting a high price is one thing for a developer or for an owner-occupier, but the cost that you need to outline in order to achieve that price is also very, very important. So it's the return on cost which is really, really critical. In order to get the $7 or $8 million, if it's costing you $5 or $6 million to get that, then your return on cost might only be $1 million, divided by 5 or 6 million, as opposed to a property that sells for a lot lower than that, and then the profit margin is the same. So we can't just be looking at the end value. We need to be looking at the profit between the as is and the to be, between the total sum invested and the total sum sold. So in that situation, I think it's not really clear that properties that have a heritage overlay don't achieve the same type of profit margin. So the answer to this question is that you can only look at a property on a case-by-case basis, and you can't make grand statements about the benefits or detriments of a heritage overlay on a property. It really depends on the postcode and the property that you're buying. So if you look at the property that we discussed, Kerry's property in the Riverside Estate, if you look at that as a perfect example, you'll remember that Kerry liked the area because he loved the Art Deco features of the property. He didn't want to build a modern extension. He wanted to build something in keeping with the era. So he valued the heritage overlay. That was really important to him. He also valued the single dwelling covenant. He didn't want units around him. So those areas will attract buyers to part with their money who value that. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to value that, but he did. And there's a group of people in the marketplace with deep pockets who are prepared to buy those properties, who want to buy those properties. And the heritage overlay is really important. You can see groups like the Heritage Society and the Art Deco Society and all these other societies that value these period homes. They have signs on their house and placards where they don't want development that's not in keeping with the area, and therefore these people find the overlays very, very valuable. Having said that, areas that don't have any restrictions, and if I could talk about the inner east, those areas which don't have any overlays, they tend to achieve higher values, because obviously if you can build, a French chateau, and if you can build a 600 square meter home, it's going to attract a higher value. But what we're not talking about though is the profit on cost. So in other words, if you look at the difference between the end value and the total cost divided by the total investment, how does that relate between properties that don't have a heritage overlay and ones that do? And the answer to that is not as clear, but it is clear that areas that don't have a heritage overlay, certainly in the inner east, they can attract higher prices because you can build bigger homes unrestricted in many, many ways in terms of the design, the style, etc. Equally though, these homes have a high level of interest even 100 years down the track. So 100 years later, people still love living in these homes. So they have scarce value. They're not making them again. Sure, you can see mock-up homes, but the existing build form that was built back in the 1900s, around the turn of the century or the early turn of the century, those homes are scarce. They're not making any more of them, and therefore they retain their value, especially if they're improved in the right manner. So because they're scarce, they retain their value. They'll always be valuable in the future, and so there's no fear. There should be no fear for a buyer who's buying these properties to worry about their property losing value. Now, whether it keeps pace with other properties, I think it will, because of the scarcity factor. But it really depends on what suburb we're talking about. One of the areas, for example, where you see that is Albert Park and Middle Park, which has a lot of Victorian era and Federation era homes, where people expect those style homes when they buy in that area. And yes, whilst there's maybe some modern contemporary homes along the beachfront which have reverse living, and there are modern homes intertwined within the development, I think people that move into that area expect to be living in that type of home. So the answer to the question is that you've got to look at every property on a case-by-case basis. And if you really want to know, just ring your local property advocate who can help you. So obviously in this case, we recommend you ring Property Buyer if you need some help in sourcing these type of properties in the marketplace.
Here's a beautiful period home, 1930s clinker brick, but there's the modern extension that we talked about, which is allowed by council. So that extension, people get to benefit from modern living without impacting the place. This is another example of contributory 1930s. Look at the brickwork, that herringbone brickwork. It's a classic of its era. So is the next door.